much for joining us for the webinar on Trust, the Performance Multiplier, in partnership with Franklin Covey. I'm Shashi from People Matters, and I would be your host for today's webcast. Before telling you about today's agenda, let me give you a brief about today's topic. Trust is often the differentiator that can help organizations convert strategy into results through proper execution. Lack of trust in any organization or leader slows down the work, increases the cost, and often leads to underperforming teams. Here are a few questions that we would try to explore through this webinar. What are the causes and impact of low trust in an organization? How to increase trust levels in an organization? How do you increase your own credibility as a leader and increase trust within your team? We have the privilege of having with us Gary T. Judd, practice leader for Franklin Covey Global Speed of Trust Practice. Gary has served as a CEO, President, COO, and Executive Strategy Advisor in several leading enterprises. In addition to Gary's practical business acumen, he has a reputation for developing people and mentoring their leadership skills. Gary has led leadership development initiatives at several leading Fortune 500 clients, as well as rapidly growing mid-sized organizations, including Marriott Corporation, Shell Oil, Ingalls Shipbuilding, Marriott Management Services, Disney Company, and several other small organizations. Our partner for today's webinar is Franklin Covey. Franklin Covey is a global company specializing in performance improvement. They help organizations achieve results that require a change in human behavior. They are one of the world's largest training companies and listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Their expertise is in 7 areas: leadership, execution, productivity, trust, sales performance, customer loyalty, and education. We have saved time for you to ask your questions at the end of the webinar. For those watching the live webinar, you can submit questions at any time during the presentation through the Q&A section. We will try to respond to as many questions as time allows. We are all super excited for today's webcast, and so without any further delay, I am going to hand over the webinar microphone to Gary. Welcome to the webcast, Gary, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you as well for having me on this webinar today. It's really an honor for us at Franklin Covey to be able to participate in the People Matters webinar. So thank you so much for the invitation. As Shashi said, we're going to be talking about trust and why it is the great performance multiplier. Why don't I begin by just jumping into our agenda of what we're going to try to cover over the next 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes. First of all, we're going to be talking about the compelling case for trust. Now, many people you've probably heard are calling trust the new currency of our interdependent collaborative world. And of course, we agree with that. So we'll explore a little deeper why there is such a compelling case for trust in our teams and organizations. We're also going to talk about how to actually create and sustain a high trust culture. We're going to talk about the 2 things that every leader, every team, every organization needs to know and do in order to create and sustain trust inside their teams and organization. And lastly, we will have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So without any hesitancy, let's jump right into the agenda and talk about this compelling case for trust. Now, Franklin Covey, over the last several years, has spent a lot of time, energy, effort, and money in trying to understand why trust is so vital inside organizations today. And we're going to talk about that these three compelling reasons about why trust matters. First reason is simple. Trust is financial. Trust is financial. Trust is economic. You know, many people see trust as only a nice-to-have, soft social virtue, but it is indeed so much more than that. You know, it's been proven in study after study that trust is an economic driver. In fact, a Watson-Wyatt study showed that total return to shareholders for organizations with high trust is nearly 3 times higher than organizations with low trust. Part of the reason for this is that trust always impacts 2 measurable outcomes. And those measurable outcomes are speed and cost. So this is really the thesis around the Speed of Trust book written by Stephen M.R. Covey, this idea that trust always impacts speed and cost. And so if I could put to you the business case for trust in its most simple yet profound expression, it would be this, is that when trust goes down inside a relationship, on a team or in an organization, at least 2 things will always happen. When trust goes down, speed will go down and cost will go up. This is called a trust tax, okay, a trust tax. Check your own experience here. I love this quote by John Whitney, who says that mistrust doubles the cost of doing business. An enterprise that is at war with itself will not have the strength or focus to survive and thrive in today's competitive environment. So with that, and thinking about this trust tax and speed and cost, let me make this bold claim. It's this: if you're trying to implement any strategy or drive any initiative inside your teams and organization that requires interdependence or collaboration, and you are trying to implement that initiative in an environment that behaves independently, where there's a silo mentality or in a dysfunctional, low-trust culture, if that's the case, then without a doubt you will pay an enormous tax in terms of speed and cost. Everything you're trying to accomplish will take longer to get done, and there will be a huge cost in terms of real dollars, in terms of money, energy, engagement, joy. You will pay a tax if you are suffering inside a low-trust organizational culture. Now, the good news is that the converse of this formula is also true. If you have high trust inside a relationship, team, or an organization, or when trust goes up in a relationship or a team or an organization, at least 2 things will always happen. Speed and efficiency will increase, and cost will decrease. We call this a trust dividend. This is why we call high trust the great performance multiplier, because it makes everything better when there is high trust. Now, this simple formula of trust and speed and cost, it really is this simple, it's this real, and it is this predictable. The reason this formula is predictable when it comes to trust is because it is an organizational principle. Let's explore this a little bit more. We say that trust is a multiplier. Okay, trust is a multiplier. Whether we're talking about low trust or high trust, trust itself is a multiplier. You're all familiar with this formula, right? This conventional wisdom. In order to get results, you've got to have a good strategy, execute well, and you'll get results. That is true. However, we would say that this formula is actually missing a critical element, and that element is trust. In fact, Stephen M.R. Covey, the author of The Speed of Trust, calls trust a hidden variable, which actually brings us to our second compelling reason of why trust matters. It's this idea. The second thing is that trust is the number one leadership competency needed today. Now, Doug Conant, who's the former CEO of Campbell's Soup, has said that trust is the leadership challenge of the new millennium, and we agree with that. But Stephen would also agree with that, and he would say that trust is the number one leadership competency needed today, and that is a bold claim. Because there are a lot of skills that you need as a leader. There are a lot of skills that your leaders need. But the most critical by far is the ability to create and sustain trust. Here's why. Think of water for a moment. Where there is water, everything flourishes and grows. When there is no water, typically most things wither and die. The same is true for trust. When there is no trust, relationships decay, projects fail, initiatives underperform, and work grinds to a crawl. In our experience, many teams are overmanaged and underled. You see, trust is the defining skill that turns a manager into a leader. It's trust that turns a group of people into a team. It's trust that turns a vendor into a true partner. It's trust that creates a strong brand with loyal customers. And trust, we would say, begins with you. We would say that as you intentionally grow trust, the stronger will be your performance and the more enduring will be your results. Again, which brings us to our third compelling reason of why trust matters. It's this, is that trust can be learned and trust can be measured. If it is a competency, and it is, it can be learned. And if it can be learned, it means that you can get good at trust. You see, when Stephen wrote the book, The Speed of Trust, people asked him, what are some of the reasons why you wrote a book on trust? He would say, well, a lot of people thought of trust as kind of a nice to have. You either have trust or you don't. It's hard to get trust, and if you lose trust, it's nearly impossible to restore, and nobody was talking about the fact that trust is a learnable competency. You can get good at trust, and trust, as this point makes, trust can be measured. Okay, and so inside an organization, we would say that we measure trust in three ways. First, the level of trust. Many teams and organizations do this, right? Many teams and organizations measure, do we have high trust, do we have low trust, do you trust your boss? What's the general level of trust? And we would say you probably don't necessarily need a measurement tool to determine if there's low or high trust, right? Because people can feel it. They know if there's low trust in an organization. But the second way you measure trust is to measure the cause. What is causing the low trust inside your organization, which is a little bit more compelling to help us understand trust a little bit deeper. And then, of course, the third way that we measure trust, that you can measure trust, is the impact that trust is having. Now, we've already talked about the impact of trust in terms of speed and cost, right? Trust always impact, speed, and cost. We talked about that. But let's go a little deeper in the impact of trust. Now, for any of you that have read The Speed of Trust, you will see down here on the screen, right below the title of the book, is the subtitle. The subtitle of the book is The One Thing That Changes Everything. Now, that too is kind of a bold claim. Trust the one thing that changes everything. Well, let's just take a look at this. I love this quote by John Stuart Mill, who said, "The advantage to mankind of being able to trust one another penetrates into every crevice and cranny of human life. The economical is perhaps the smallest part of it, yet even this is incalculable." So what about inside an organization, things that are important to organizational performance like collaboration and engagement and innovation? Let's look at what the data says about those types of things. Okay, trust does change collaboration. The study by Lewicki and Zafane said that trust is a critical foundation to build collaboration in the workplace. Without trust, employees are not able to work together. What about partnering? Well, there was a 10-year study by hundreds of outsourcing contracts that demonstrated that outsourcing contracts that are managed on trust rather than on stringent service level agreements led to benefits for both parties as much as an additional 40% of the value of the contract. You see, trust is economic. It is a business driver. What about innovation? Well, a study contrasting the top 20% with the bottom 20% in terms of innovation found that trust was the #1 differentiator. According to the study, trust was the single most significant factor in differentiating successful innovators. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer. This last one that came out, this is what they have to say about trust and innovation. They say that the important insight for companies seeking to implement innovative technologies is that the traditional game plan will not work. In a world of dispersed authority, a new compact of trust must be forged between the individual and the corporation. What about employee engagement? Well, there was a Canadian research firm that studied 26 drivers of employee engagement. And they found that the #1 driver of engagement was, you guessed it, trust. And, of course, I love this study by the Dublin University Business School that says as trust goes up in an organization, so does employee engagement. That's what we call the great employee engagement paradox. Let me just quickly share an example of one of our clients, DirecTV, 7,400 employees. Here are the trust taxes they were paying. There was inefficiency and chaos due to 6 acquisitions in 3 years. High technician turnover was at 36% a year. Now, that technician turnover is in a population of just over 6,000 people. They turned over 36% a year. They couldn't, of course, move their employee engagement scores. Wonder why? They came to us to help solve their employee engagement score and flat productivity. Well, after working with this, focusing on trust and the speed of trust for a year, here were their results. Their overall employee engagement score was up 13 percentage points in the first year. Now, Towers Watson is the organization that measures their employee engagement. They told the Towers Watson people, we want to move our employee engagement 5 to 6 points. And they said, you can't move 5 to 6 percentage points in employee engagement in 1 year across a population of 7,400. Nearly impossible. You'll only get a 4% increase if you really do a good job. Well, when the data came back and said that they moved it 13 percentage points, the people at Towers Watson had to take a look at their algorithms, make sure everything was right. They did it twice. Sure enough, they moved it 13 percentage points. Why? Because that's the great employee engagement paradox, which is you don't increase employee engagement by focusing on engagement. You change employee engagement by focusing on trust. More results, technician turnover went from 36% to 24%, first time in 3 years, which equaled $9 million in savings in the cost of hiring and training employees. And of course, productivity measurably increased across all 100 of their sites. Now, that was about 4 years ago. We got this data from the client back that said, okay, it's been 4 years later, we're still focusing on trust. Now their employee engagement has moved an additional 6% from the first year up to 88%. When you ask the client why trust, this is what Carlos Botero, the EVP of HR, said. 4 years running of organizational health improvements. The foundation is trust. Now, one of their issues at DirecTV was turnover, right? What do the studies say about the correlation between trust and keeping your people? Well, high trust organizations have a turnover rate less than 1/3 their respective industry average. Trust is an economic driver. What about employee satisfaction? I love this study by Helwell Huang. Shows that a 10% increase in trust in an organization has the equivalent effect on employee satisfaction as a 36% increase in pay. That's right. A 10% increase in trust has the same effect on employee satisfaction as a 36% increase in pay. And there was a Dutch consulting firm did a study that shows that as trust goes up inside an organization, employee satisfaction goes up disproportionately higher. Okay? What about employee commitment? Everybody's concerned about employee commitment. Well, various researchers have shown that organizational trust to be a significant predictor of organizational commitment. That was a study from Podskoff and Ashford. Okay, now we've talked about how trust impacts employee commitment, different studies on it, how it impacts innovation, collaboration, satisfaction, engagement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We could go on and on and on. In fact, we have similar studies on, we don't have the time to go over those, similar studies on leading change, studies on how trust impacts diversity, how trust impacts safety, shareholder value, agility, even joy and happiness, and even national prosperity. The bottom line is that if you want to move the needle on employee commitment or satisfaction or employee engagement, if you want to become an innovative, collaborative organization, then you have to focus on trust. You have to have a deliberate and intentional approach to creating trust inside your organization. What we've learned over and over and over again is that many organizational performance issues are actually trust issues in disguise. We love to use this metaphor many of our clients use that help really cement this idea. See, most people know, here's the metaphor. It's a metaphor about ocean currents. You see, most people know and are aware that ocean currents are one of the most powerful forces that influence climate on Earth. However, many people are unaware that there's actually two types of ocean currents. What we can see are called surface currents, and surface currents make up only about 10% of all the ocean currents on our planet. The other 90% are called deep water currents. These deep water currents are driven primarily by gravity, and they differ from surface currents in terms of scale, energy, and speed, and they can determine the climate of entire continents. And although they are typically unseen, they have incredible, even exponential power to influence everything that happens on the surface. Consider your team and organization that you are part of right now. Most of what you do day to day, most of what you manage as a leader is what you can see, like the currents on the surface of the ocean. But the cultural undercurrent of trust, the deep water currents, well, they're a lot more difficult to see and hard to affect, and yet they still have incredible power. You see, these deep water currents directly impact everything on the surface. Trust is the deep water current in your relationships, team, and organization, and they affect every interaction, every communication, project, initiative that you are engaged in. And leaders who understand this and have a deliberate approach and focus on trust, they are the ones that lead teams and organizations that have amazing energy, and they're able to operate with incredible speed. That's probably why the late Dr. Stephen R. Covey said this quote. He said, "The only sustainable competitive advantage that will long endure is the core competency of a high-trust organizational culture." Now, we all know what culture is. We all know culture is powerful. Peter Drucker has this quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." But what we're exploring today is why a high-trust culture? Why did Dr. Covey say that it was a high-trust culture that is the only sustainable competitive advantage? Why didn't he say a culture of performance or a culture of collaboration or quality or a culture of effectiveness or a values-based culture? Why did he say high trust? Well, because if you're a leader and you're trying to create a culture of engagement or of collaboration or of performance, basically if you're trying to create any winning culture, you need to start with trust. Trust is the deeper cultural well. If you think about it, can you really create a culture of collaboration without trust? Can you really create an innovative culture, or can you sustain high performance with all of your stakeholders if you or your team is not trusted? No, it can't be done. You see, trust is the deep water current, and a high trust culture is really the life spring and the foundation of all winning cultures. As we work with teams and organizations around the world, there are a lot of expectations on people. Leaders are expected to manage change, and they're expected to lead high-performing teams that are agile, collaborative, innovative, and engaged. And we would boldly claim that you can't do any of those things well without trust. Well, as we start now to talk about how to do something about trust, in just a second, we're going to get into this second agenda item. Stephen M.R. Covey, who wrote The Speed of Trust, Dr. Covey's oldest son, said this: "Trust is the most overlooked, misunderstood, underutilized asset an organization can access to enable performance, and its impact, for good or bad, is dramatic and pervasive. It's something you can't escape." Now, I'm sharing that because we know it's important. We know it's critical. Nobody argues with trust, right? Everybody knows it's important. So then why is a high trust culture so difficult to create and sustain? Well, there's a great Warren Buffett quote that says, "Trust is like the air we breathe. When it's present, nobody really notices, but when it's absent, everybody notices." In fact, Stephen calls trust the hidden variable. Now, let me say this. So trust really is an outcome. If there's only one thing you remember from our webinar today, I want you to remember this idea, that trust is an outcome. And sometimes we confuse the feeling of trust with the actual things that it takes to create trust. We confuse trust, the noun, with trust, the verb. But trust is an outcome. Trust is an outcome. It's a function of language and behavior. You see, here's the thing. Regardless of our job, regardless of our role, all grand strategies must eventually degenerate down to real work done by real people. And we would say that in the fabric, woven into the fabric of that real work, is either language and behavior that creates trust or language and behavior that destroys trust. Okay? Trust is an outcome of how we speak and behave in the context of doing our work every day. And so as we move on to this next piece, let me just say this. We have uncovered the business case for trust. We know that trust is economic. We know that it impacts engagement and turnover and every other organizational performance metric. We know that. We've proven it. It's the approach that we take. The power at Franklin Covey is not necessarily in that, but rather actually how you do something about it. That really is the power of the speed of trust, because the speed of trust provides a framework for seeing trust differently. It creates a common language to speak about trust and a process so that managers, leaders can intentionally create and sustain a high trust culture. And we're going to look at this framework, part of this framework now, as we jump into the second agenda item, which is, okay, how do you do something about it? How do you actually create and sustain a culture of high trust? Well, it's basically two things that we're going to talk about in just a second. It really leads us to this idea of how trust works. And we can't explore that without showing this simple framework. We call this the 5 waves of trust. 5 waves of trust really is the learning construct for the speed of trust, which basically says trust starts with you. It starts with our own credibility. It moves out to our relationships and the behavior we use. And then organizational trust is about alignment. Market trust is all about our brand and reputation, and then it ripples out to impact complete societies. So if you would ask Franklin Covey, how do you do it? How do you build a high trust culture? We would simply say that a high trust culture is built on a foundation of 2 things, credibility and behavior. Okay? A high trust culture is built on the foundation of credibility and behavior. let's take a look first at this notion of credibility, which brings us to that first wave of trust, self-trust. Okay, self-trust is all about our credibility. Okay, let's just explore this using this metaphor of the tree. Our credibility rests on our character and our competence. Oftentimes our character is below the surface, not always seen. Our competence above the surface, the trunk and the leaves and the fruit of the tree. But you have to have both character and competence. And these four cores of credibility, the first two have to do with our character, integrity and intent. We're going to explore these in just a second a little more deeply. At the competence level is our capabilities and results. So your credibility boils down to these four issues: integrity, intent, capabilities, and results. The first two have to do with character, and the last two have to do with competence. Let's just take a look at these quickly. Let's first, this core of credibility around integrity. We know what integrity is, right? It's deep honesty and truthfulness. It is who we really are. It includes congruence, humility, and courage. It's this notion of integrity. The second core of credibility is our intent. The question we ask is, what is your agenda? You know, intent is your fundamental motive or agenda, right? And the agenda that inspires the greatest trust is seeking mutual benefit, okay? Intent is all about your agenda and opening up your agenda when you can. The third core of credibility is all about our capabilities and ask the question, are you relevant? You know, capable people and organizations inspire confidence and trust. It has to do with our talents, attitudes, skills, knowledge, and style. A great question to ask ourselves relative to our capabilities is, do I have 15 years of experience, or do I have 1 year of experience repeated 15 times? That is a very different question, always staying relevant. This last core of credibility has to do with the results that we produce, because results matter, right? People evaluate your results and your performance on past performance, your current performance, and what they anticipate how you will perform in the future. Results matter, and if you cannot produce results, you will not be credible, okay? Now, when you take a look at these four cores of credibility, these are our four cores of credibility cards. If you take a look at intent, on the back of each card are what we call our credibility accelerators, our intent accelerators. And when you think about, I just want to make one point on this. This is what we would call a high leveraged leadership behavior. Sounds simple enough, but starting in that red circle, here it is. State your intent, signal it, clarify it, and discuss it. Okay? Being able to learn the leadership skill of declaring your intent is a simple yet powerful leadership behavior. I love this quote by Gandhi, who said, "The moment there is suspicion about a person's motives, everything he does becomes tainted." It's such a small, simple thing to declare our intent, but many managers neglect this simple but powerful leadership behavior of declaring your intent. What we've learned over the years is that people don't follow strategy or good ideas. What they do is they follow leaders who are credible. In fact, we would say if you don't have credibility, you aren't a leader. Leaders increase their credibility through this trust process. Let's now talk about this second piece of the foundation on relationship trust, right? And how you actually build a high trust culture. It's about behavior, the behavior of your people. And it's not just any behavior, okay? We have learned over the years that there are 13 very specific behaviors that are foundational to every healthy, high trust organizational culture. That's the good news. The bad news is that there are also 13 counterfeit behaviors common to every unhealthy, dysfunctional, low trust culture. And we're going to explore these behaviors quickly in our last few minutes. These behaviors bring us to the second wave of trust, relationship trust. In other words, the principle of behavior. So in order to begin thinking about relationship trust, I want you to think about a high trust relationship you have with someone at work. Okay, think about that. Just take a second. Get that person in your mind. Who is at work where I have a high trust relationship? Now ask yourself these rhetorical questions. What is it like to work with this person? What is it like to communicate with this person? Is it fast? Is it slow? Is it easy? Is it labored? How long does it take to get work done? And are there efficiencies that come when there is high trust in a relationship? And what kind of results are you able to achieve? Okay? Now, you've got that. We're going to shift gears, and we're going to contrast that with someone at work where you have a low trust relationship. Think about someone at work where there is low trust. And then ask yourself the same questions. What's work like? What is communication like? How long does it take to get work done? If you notice when you're working with someone you don't trust, it doesn't matter how clear your communication is. It doesn't matter how measured every single word is. It doesn't matter how many people you copy on your email. They will always miss your meaning. Okay, now would you say the difference in these two relationships is just incremental? Are they small differences? Or would you say the differences in terms of communication, efficiency, getting work done, getting results, the differences are exponential? Well, we would say that the differences in these two relationships are not incremental. They are exponential. And what if you had every single relationship individually and across teams were low trust? Imagine what that would do to the work itself. What you're discovering as you uncover these high trust and low trust relationships, so there's actually 13 behaviors of high trust. Behaviors like demonstrate respect, create transparency, keep commitments, common sense, right? Common sense, clarify expectations, confront reality, etc. So let's just explore one behavior before we wrap up to get a sense of what we're talking about and the importance of understanding these counterfeit behaviors. So these are one of our tools in the Speed of Trust process. Talk straight is the first behavior. The behavior, you can read it. It's be honest, tell the truth, let people know where you stand, use simple language, call things what they are, demonstrate integrity, don't manipulate people or distort facts, don't spin the truth. Don't leave false impressions. And you'll see the opposite, right, is to lie or deceive. On the back of the card, there are some phrases of what to say, some actual language to use to talk straight. And then down at the bottom, I will really want you to pay attention to this. This is the counterfeit behavior of talk straight. And here's the counterfeit. See, spinning, positioning, posturing, and manipulating, withholding information, beating around the bush, double talking, flattering, corporate speak, technically telling the truth, but leaving the wrong impression. The reason I point this out is that the behavior itself and the opposite, they seem pretty self-evident. We get the opposite. Most people don't have trouble with the opposite. But if there is low trust in a relationship or on a team or in an organization, it is because people are behaving the counterfeit behaviors. It's this counterfeit zone, really, that creates a low trust organizational culture. In fact, we would say that counterfeit behavior is what actually defines a low trust culture. Counterfeit behavior destroys your credibility and undermines organizational performance. Now, in closing, I'm going to show you just one more client example. Then we're going to open it up for questions. But let me just make this statement about trust. If you want to deliberately and intentionally create trust, then you need to focus on credibility and behavior. If you want to tap into a different in kind level of performance, then focus on integrity, intent, capabilities, and results. Focus on the 4 cores of credibility and the 13 behaviors. It's these 4 cores and these behaviors that are the engine that creates and sustains high trust and is the great performance multiplier. 4 cores and the 13 behaviors really are the great performance multiplier. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a client whose complete focus was on helping managers, supervisors, and leaders become more credible and getting rid of counterfeit behaviors in their culture. When they focused on credibility and behavior, let's take a look at their impact. This is a very large organization in the United States. It's an energy organization, and inside that energy organization was an IT department of 1,200 employees. Here's the trust taxes that the IT organization inside this large energy company was facing. Increasing costs. Their behavior didn't support the one-team mentality, declining performance, degradation of operations, and really a disconnect between what was needed and what was delivered. Okay, those were really the trust taxes that were being faced by this organization, Energy Future Holdings, and they focused on credibility and behavior. When they focused on trust, here's the impact in terms of organizational performance. Okay, here was the impact. They had a 96% increase in system reliability. So basically, they went from 1,700 hours of system downtime across 500 applications to 50 hours of system downtime. They had a 92% increase in their cyber maturity score. Again, that's measured by an outside firm. Speed of delivery on new projects increased 50%. Customer service scores increased just a little over 50%, and this is my favorite. They saw a 26% decrease in total IT costs. While everyone else in their industry was increasing IT costs at about 2% a year, this organization had a decrease of 26% in total IT costs. When you focus on credibility and behavior, when you focus on trust, it really is the thing that drives organizational performance. And we would claim, and we've seen our clients over and over again, when they implement the speed of trust, individual behavior will change. Managers will lead their teams in new and different ways, and speed will increase and costs will decrease. People will be more engaged, more committed, and accountable for results. Why? Because people like to work in a high trust culture, and they don't like to work when there's low trust. A culture of high trust dramatically improves performance. Again, we've seen this over and over and over again, and the methodology that Franklin Covey has is a simple way and a simple process so that people can be, teams and organizations can be deliberate and intentional about creating trust inside the culture. I will leave you with this quote, that trust becomes a performance multiplier only when the leader is prepared to go first. With that, I will say thank you very much for your time and attention, and would love to field any questions for the next 10 minutes or so.
Wow, what a fantastic session. Thank you so much, Kerry. Now we have started receiving questions from our live attendees, and to start the Q&A section, our first question coming up is by Priya Medawar, and her question is, what are behavioral indicators which managers display to show that he or she trusts the subordinate?
What are the behavioral indicators that a manager
should display so that he he or she trusts his subordinates?
What are the behavioral indicators which
managers should display to show that they trust their teammates?
Oh, that's a great question. What are the behavioral indicators that a manager should display that indicates that they trust their people? Well, first of all, you would say that all of those 13 behaviors, like demonstrate respect and keep commitments, would listen first would be an example of behavioral indicators. Another one, it's this 13th behavior. And let me say this again. There are 13 specific behaviors that we talked about. We only mentioned one of them, really. Talk straight. Let me just say this: the first 12 behaviors are really, if a manager does that well, they will be a trusted manager. But it's this 13th behavior that really helps to transform a manager into a trusted leader. And this 13th behavior is extend trust. And I'll just read this to you. Demonstrate a propensity to trust. Extend trust abundantly to those who have earned your trust. Extend trust continually to those who are earning your trust. Learn how to appropriately extend smart trust to others based on the situation, the risk, and the credibility of the people involved. Don't withhold trust just because there is risk. So I would say really this idea of extending trust is really a motivating force for people. And then, whether it is listen first, keeping commitments, and a really important one, of course, is clarifying expectations, etc. So those are some very specific behaviors that would be important for a leader to demonstrate that they trust their people.
Thank you, Gary, for answering Priya Medhavi's query. I'm sure Priya must be satisfied with her answer. So next question coming up is by Priya Mahamri, and she wants to know what are the various tools which can be used to measure trust in an organization.
What are the tools used to measure trust inside the organization? Was that the right question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
That is a great question. Let me just go to that slide real quick and see if we can just find that right here. Okay, and that'll help us actually. Right. There we go. All right. So as you look at this slide, how do you measure trust inside an organization? First of all, a lot of people really just measure. Number one, they ask questions like, and there's all kinds of tools that can do this, right? How do you, a tool that just asks questions like, do you trust your boss? Is there high trust in the culture? Is there low trust in the culture? Do you trust your teammates? Many tools do that. The second one, which is a little more granular and more important, is a tool. For example, we have a speed of trust organizational index or a team index. If you want to measure trust on in an intact work team or trust in an organization, it would be the organizational trust index. But in that case, what we do is we measure number two, what is causing the trust level, right? So what we do is we measure credibility and behavior. We measure the perception of the culture around how credible the culture feels. What's the credibility level of the people? What's the credibility level of the leaders? And it also measures the behaviors. For example, using this particular index, the speed of trust team or organizational index, it would be one thing to know that trust is low. But it would be a completely different thing to know that it's low because we don't talk straight, we don't demonstrate respect, and we are not transparent. 3 specific behaviors. And when you measure the cause of trust using a tool like the Speed of Trust Team or Organizational Index, it just adds a lot more power to your measurement because you can then actually do something about it. And then measuring the impact of trust can be done in all sorts of ways, from measuring employee engagement, turnover, productivity, etc. Hopefully that answered your question.
I'm sure, Gary, and I'm sure Priya might be very happy with the answer. So next question coming up is by Arushi Cho, and her question is, how do we know that the decrease in turnover is necessarily speaking to a high trust culture?
Say that one more time, please. I'm sorry, you cut out just a little bit.
Sure. So Arushi's question is, how do we know that the decrease in turnover is necessarily speaking to a high or low trust culture?
Right. So how do we know that the degree of turnover you're facing is related to a high or a low trust culture? That's a great question. I would make 2 comments. The first one is, first of all, we know from, there have been many, many studies that say that one of the primary reasons why people leave an organization is because they don't trust their immediate supervisor, right? So in fact, some people would say people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. And so we know that's true. The other thing that I would say is to take a look, not because some turnover in an organization is absolutely normal, right? It's normal to have turnover in organizations, but take a look at the turnover relative to other organizations in your same industry and market. And so, for example, the example I gave on my slide deck with DirecTV, they had several competitors that were doing the same thing that they were. Their competitors had a turnover of just under 20% a year. They had a turnover of 36%. And so while there is turnover in the industry, their turnover was significantly higher than their competitors. And so really kind of that looking and seeing how your turnover compares to your competitors, in similar industry and market would be really important. And then, obviously with surveys, exit interviews, et cetera, if you did a trust survey, for example, and found that you had a very high trust culture, yet but turnover was an issue, then obviously it's not trust. So hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you, Gary, for answering Ayushi's question. Our next question coming up is by Abhishek Srivastava, and his question is, in an organization with average tenure of 8 years and average employee age of 45, where employees have their own pre-notion about others, how to build trust culture in such company? What should be the role of HR?
Was that in an organization where the average age is 45, what should be the goal of HR relative to creating trust? Did I get that right?
Yes, absolutely.
That's a great question. And, one of the things that is unique about trust, and as we have studied trust in all sorts of different sized organizations, different types of organizations in different markets with different aged employees, with the new millennials coming on, and we all know the issues there. One of the things that we have consistently found is that this idea of credibility and behavior and language holds true regardless of the age of your workforce, right? And regardless of age, people like to be trusted, and they like the notion of people having integrity and having the right intent. They like the idea of not behaving the counterfeit behavior. So I would say that, other HR professionals that we've worked with have told us that really the key is just getting real clarity on the values of your organization and then translating those values into observable, learnable, high-trust behaviors so that you can actually operationalize your values through behavior. I would say that is probably an important focus.
Thank you, Gary, for answering Abhishek's question. Our next question coming up is by Alfonso de Souza, and his question is, how can you trust someone who has broken your trust multiple times, and especially when he is an important stakeholder?
Oh, that is a tough question. What do you do when someone has broken your trust multiple times, and then you added the degree of difficulty higher, which is, and the relationship is important to you, right?
Yes.
And so let me just, before I answer the question, let me make a comment. Every time Stephen speaks and does a Q&A, Stephen M. R. Covey, the author of The Speed of Trust, sometimes he'll speak to a live audience and do a Q&A. Sometimes he'll do a conference call or a webinar and he'll do a Q&A. The single most common question that he gets is this very question. How do you restore trust? What should you do, and is it possible to restore trust when trust has been broken so very many times? So I'm just going to make a comment that this really is a key question. So let me answer it this way. First of all, it's a difficult thing, and one of the things that's important to understand when it comes to trust that we really didn't talk about is the fact that we're not saying, oh my goodness, you need to trust everyone around you and the world will be a lovely place and everything will be better. We're not saying that at all. We're actually talking about something called smart trust, which is a model that helps us know how to trust when there is risk. And what this listener is talking about is, how do I trust someone when there is risk? And you've identified extreme risk. Risk number one is that you've been burned over and over again, and risk number two, this is an important stakeholder, right? And so what we would say is you've got to actually use two components. Analysis, right? You've got to have high analysis in order to determine when and how to trust this particular person. And because you can't just trust blindly, but you also have to have a propensity to trust. And the other thing that I would do is, there's actually a behavioral process about restoring trust, specifically when the other person has made the mistake. Let me just quickly go through these very practical steps. The first step is, and so the question is, how do I restore trust with someone when that person is the one that messed up, right? The first step is to start with you, because trust always starts with you. And what we mean by that is really look at your intent. What do you really want, and have you contributed to the situation, right? The second thing is demonstrate respect and declare your intent, right? So always be respectful, but open up your intent. Share your agenda with this person. And by the way, I would say that in this particular case, if you're having a conversation with this person, I would say you would not use the word trust. You would not use the word trust. you would use the word confidence. You might have a conversation that says, it's important for me that we work together well, and I really want you to have confidence in me, and I want to have confidence in each other. Here's my intent. The next is to confront reality and talk straight. Here's what I saw, and I'm going to talk straight, and then listen to their response. The fourth really is to clarify expectations so that you can both get clear behaviorally about what you're trying to accomplish. And then, as I mentioned up front, extend smart trust. And the fact is, in some situations, smart trust means trusting very, very sparingly based on past experience. Hopefully that's helpful. And I apologize that answer was a little long because it looks like we're about out of time.
Thank you, Gary, for answering Alfonso's question. I'm sure Alfonso now knows how to behave next time in future to handle these kind of situations. What a fantastic session. We are still receiving so many questions from our attendees, but unfortunately we are running out of time and we have to wrap up our today's webcast. But we would like to request you, Gary, to take the remaining questions offline for our attendees.
Sure, I would be happy to. If you want to send me the list of questions, I will try to answer them for you, yes. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time. Thank you for spending time today. I really, really appreciate it. I'm very, very grateful. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for your time and invaluable information that you have shared with us in today's webcast. And a special thanks to our webinar partner, Covey. And I would like to thank everybody in the webinar audience for participating in today's presentation. We will come back to you with many more. That concludes today's webcast. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.